Hi guys, welcome to my channel. Today's video dives into bone-chilling mysteries the world may never solve. Dark tales that haunt the shadows and defy explanation. Ready to face the unknown? Let's begin. It began with the wind. Not the casual, playful kind that tugged at coats and ruffled hair, but a slow, deliberate push, the sort of wind that seemed to come from nowhere and move with a purpose. It scraped across the valley like an unseen predator, brushing dead leaves across the asphalt in restless spirals. When the first reports came in about the strange noises, no one in the small town of Rathburn took them seriously. Places in the mountains always made strange noises. Old pines creaking in the cold, the moan of wind through ravines, the distant crack of ice breaking on a frozen stream. But these weren't those noises. Mrs. Keller was the first to notice. She was 83 and nearly blind in one eye, yet her hearing was as sharp as it had been in her girlhood. She swore to anyone who would listen that she heard voices coming from the abandoned mine 3 miles outside of town. "Not echoes," she told the sheriff, clutching his arm with paper-thin fingers. "Words, clear words, speaking in something I don't understand." Sheriff Hollis made the polite noises one makes to an old woman, but his eyes shifted toward the rest of the station staff. None of them wanted to go poking around that mine. The Rathburn mine had been sealed off since 1968 after a collapse trapped 13 men inside. Rescue efforts failed. The bodies were never recovered. For years, it had been the stuff of schoolyard dares. Kids sneaking up to touch the rusted gate, swearing they'd heard tapping or whispers from within. But this was the first time in decades someone had claimed actual words, and the strange part was, Mrs. Keller wasn't the only one. Within a week, 3 more townsfolk came forward. One of them, a trucker named Paul Baring, said he'd been parked near the old service road when he heard what sounded like singing, low, steady, and impossibly deep. "Not like a man's voice," he said over coffee at the diner. "Like the earth itself was humming." Others claimed to have recorded the sounds, but when they played the clips back, all that could be heard was the wind. By the second week, people started seeing lights. Faint glimmers in the night, moving along the tree line near the mine's entrance. Too far to be lanterns, too slow to be flashlights. They drifted and bobbed with a strange deliberation, as though searching for something. And they never appeared when you tried to watch for them. Only when you'd glance away, when your mind was elsewhere, would the glow catch your eye from the corner of your vision. On the 15th day, the sheriff went missing. Hollis had been a fixture of Rathburn for 27 years. That morning, his cruiser was found on the service road, driver's side door wide open, keys still in the ignition. Tire tracks led toward the mine gate, then simply stopped, as if the vehicle had been lifted away. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no Hollis. It was as if he had stepped out of existence. The town fell into a nervous quiet after that. Schools stayed open, but parents walked their children to the bus stop. The diner, usually full of old men arguing politics, kept its conversations short and low. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to name it, except for Claire Whitmore. Claire was 29, a freelance journalist who'd come back to Rathburn after her father passed away. She'd grown up hearing the mine stories, laughing them off as backwoods superstition. But when Hollis vanished, something in her stirred. A need to understand, to prove or disprove once and for all the old rumors. She started visiting Mrs. Keller, coaxing the old woman to repeat exactly what she'd heard. She tracked down Paul Baring and got him to take her to the exact spot where he'd heard the humming. She even tried to find the recordings people had made, though most were accidentally deleted or lost in ways that didn't feel accidental at all. On a gray, brittle morning in early November, Claire decided she'd go to the mine herself. Not alone. She wasn't reckless enough for that, but with someone who knew the land. That someone was Mark Reddick, a former rescue worker who'd been part of the last official search in the mine before it was sealed. He was in his 60s now, big hands permanently scarred from rock falls and rope burns, and he had a voice like worn gravel. When she told him her plan, he shook his head for a long time before answering. "You think you're chasing a ghost story," he said. "But some places, they don't just hold on to the dead. They chew on 'em, and sometimes they spit them back out." "Then all the more reason to see it," she replied. "If there's something in there, people deserve to know." They set out that afternoon. The road to the mine wound through skeletal trees, their branches rattling like dry bones in the cold air. As they walked, Mark spoke sparingly, telling her which rock formations were unstable, which parts of the ridge tended to slide after rain. He seemed more watchful than wary, eyes scanning the tree-line as though expecting someone, or something, to be following. The mine's gate was worse than Claire remembered. Rusted through in places, bent at unnatural angles, it looked less like it had been damaged by weather and more like it had been twisted, deliberately warped by hands too strong to belong to any man. The padlock was gone. "This was locked last time I came here," Mark said softly. They stepped inside. The first thing that struck Claire was the air, thick, cold, and faintly metallic, with a hint of something sweet and rotten underneath. The second was the sound. It wasn't voices, not exactly, but there was a rhythm, a subtle pulse, as if the mine itself had a heartbeat. They followed the main tunnel, their flashlights carving narrow tunnels of light through the blackness. Water dripped somewhere far ahead. Twice, Mark stopped suddenly, tilting his head toward the dark. But when Claire asked what he heard, he only shook his head and urged her forward. After what felt like an hour, they reached a fork, one tunnel sloping downward, the other curving sharply left. Mark pointed to the left. "That's where the collapse was. Bodies should have been there, but we never found them." Before they could move, the pulse in the air grew stronger. It was faint at first, like distant footsteps on stone, but it built steadily, each thud rattling through Claire's chest. Then came the sound, a low, resonant hum, impossibly deep, vibrating in the marrow of her bones. She turned to Mark, but his flashlight was shaking in his hand, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "That's not wind," he whispered. The hum shifted, rising in pitch until it became something almost like a voice. The syllables were alien, thick with consonants her mind couldn't quite hold on to, and yet, she felt she knew their meaning. Something old, something patient, something calling. Her breath caught when she saw movement in the dark. Not shapes exactly, more like the absence of light, a deeper blackness spilling into the beam of her flashlight. It moved with fluid precision, twisting and folding into itself, and as it did, the hum grew louder, wrapping around her thoughts like a tightening fist. Mark grabbed her arm. "We need to go." They turned, but the tunnel behind them wasn't the same. The walls seemed narrower, the floor uneven, and somewhere behind them came the unmistakable sound of someone walking, slow, deliberate steps, perfectly in time with the hum. Claire didn't remember running, only the sense of weight pressing down on her chest. The way the light at the tunnel's mouth seemed impossibly far away. She stumbled out into the cold air just as the hum cut off, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing. Mark emerged seconds later, his face pale, eyes wide. They didn't speak on the walk back. That night, Claire listened to the recording she'd made. At first, it was only their footsteps, the occasional drip of water. Then, faintly, the hum began. She braced for it to rise into those impossible syllables. But instead, there was a voice. Clear. Human. It was Sheriff Hollis. "Help me," he said, over and over, the words stretching and breaking until they were no longer human at all. Claire listened to the recording 6 times before she finally stopped, her hands trembling too much to keep the phone steady. The first few plays, she told herself it had to be some kind of distortion. Sound bouncing strangely in the tunnels, or maybe her brain filling in patterns where there weren't any. But by the 6th time, there was no denying it. That was Sheriff Hollis's voice. And it wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Each "help me" sounded more fractured than the last, the syllables breaking into something unnatural, as though the mouth forming them no longer remembered exactly how human speech worked. Mark hadn't wanted to talk after they left the mine, but when she called him that night, he picked up on the second ring. "You heard it too," she said. A pause. Then, "I told you that place chews on people. You think it's coincidence we never found those bodies?" She could hear him breathing hard, like he'd just finished running. "I don't know what you want from me, Claire. I'm not going back in there. Not after whatever that was." "It was Hollis," she insisted. "We can't just leave him. What if he's still alive?" Mark's voice cracked into a laugh with no humor in it. "You think that was a man still alive after weeks down there? You think that was even him at all?" The line went quiet. Claire waited, but he didn't speak again. By morning, she'd made up her mind. If Hollis, or something wearing his voice, was down there, she needed more evidence. She spent the day gathering supplies. Extra batteries, rope, chalk to mark her path, a better flashlight. She even dug out her old climbing harness in case she had to descend into one of the deeper shafts. She also brought a small metal flask of whiskey, not because she drank much, but because her father had always told her a swig of it could steal the nerves before you did something you knew was a bad idea. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. The fewer people who knew, the fewer who could try to stop her. By late afternoon, she was back at the mine. The wind had picked up since the day before, whistling through the gaps in the gate like a soft warning. She ignored it and stepped inside, marking a white X on the wall just past the entrance. Every 20 feet, she left another chalk mark. She wasn't going to be one of those people who wandered in and never came out. The hum started sooner this time. Within 5 minutes, she felt it under her skin, a faint tremor that made her teeth ache. It wasn't constant. It seemed to swell when she reached certain points, like stepping into invisible currents. She tried to note these spots on her phone, but the GPS signal had already died. As she moved deeper, she began to notice something else. The walls weren't the same as before. In certain places, the rock was darker, slicker, as if wet, though when she touched it her fingers came away dry. And carved into these patches, though carved wasn't quite the word, were shapes. Circles within circles. Lines that spiraled inward and then broke off abruptly, like they'd been swallowed by the stone itself. Once, she thought she saw one of the spirals shift just slightly, as though it were still in the process of being drawn. She pressed on. At the fork where Mark had pointed to the collapsed tunnel, she hesitated. That had been the source of the hum the day before. Today, though, it was coming from the downward-sloping tunnel to the right. Claire swallowed hard and took the slope. The air grew colder as she descended. So cold her breath came in visible bursts. Her flashlight beam began to catch flecks in the air. Dust at first, then tiny white fragments that she realized were not stone at all but bone. Small, brittle, no bigger than splinters. Yet they littered the ground as if carried here by some unseen current. The hum deepened. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was sensation, vibrating through her ribs, pressing against her spine. And woven into it, almost too faint to notice, were voices. Dozens of them, speaking over one another in a language she couldn't understand. Then one voice cut through the rest. Claire. Her name drawn out slowly, the vowels stretched until they didn't sound like part of any human speech. She froze, light sweeping over the walls as she tried to find the source. Claire, the voice said again, closer this time. She didn't run. Not yet. She took 3 careful steps forward and found herself in a narrow chamber where the ceiling dipped low enough that she had to stoop. The walls here were covered in those spirals. So many they overlapped in chaotic layers, some pulsing faintly in the glow of her flashlight. And in the center of the room was Hollis, or what was left of him. He was standing upright, though his feet didn't touch the ground. Strands of something black and fibrous, like roots but glistening wet, wrapped around his ankles, wrists, and neck, holding him suspended. His skin was pale and stretched tight, his lips moving in slow, jerky motions. "Help me," he said, though the words seemed to emerge from the hum rather than from his mouth. Claire's stomach turned. "Hollis, it's me, Claire. What happened to you?" His eyes, if they could still be called that, shifted toward her. The irises were gone, replaced by a milky whiteness that reflected her flashlight in strange, dull flashes. His lips moved again, but this time the sound that came was not his voice at all. It was her father's. "You shouldn't have come here, kiddo." The shock hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Her father had been dead for 3 years, buried in the Rathburn Cemetery under a stone she'd visited countless times. But the voice kept talking, warm and familiar. "You can't save him. You can't save anyone here. It's been too long. They've been listening for you." The hum surged, and Hollis's head snapped back unnaturally far, his mouth opening wider than it should have. From deep within his throat, or whatever had replaced it, came a sound like stone grinding on stone. Something moved in the darkness behind him. It was vast, yet impossible to focus on. Claire could see only parts of it at a time, shards of an outline that never added up to a whole. A joint bending in the wrong direction. A surface that shifted between rough rock and slick flesh. Dozens of eyes, or maybe none at all, opening and closing in unison. Her instincts finally screamed loud enough to cut through the shock. She turned and ran. The tunnel seemed longer on the way out. Her chalk marks came slower than she remembered, and twice she reached an X only to realize she didn't remember drawing it. The hum chased her, ebbing and swelling, the voices multiplying until they became an almost physical force pushing her forward. She burst into the gray daylight gasping for air, her legs shaking so badly she nearly collapsed. When she looked back at the mine entrance, there was nothing there. Just the same rusted gate, swaying slightly in the wind. Claire didn't remember the walk back to town. She found herself at her kitchen table hours later, staring at her recorder. Her thumb hovered over the play button. When she finally pressed it, the first thing she heard was her own breathing. Then the hum. And then, clear as day, her father's voice again, saying something he never could have known she'd hear. "They'll come for you at night." The recording cut off. Claire's lights flickered. The lights steadied after only a second, but in that breath of darkness Claire felt something shift in the air around her. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to set every nerve on edge. She stood in her kitchen without moving, listening. The refrigerator's low hum, the faint ticking of the clock above the stove, the slow creak of the old house settling in the cold. And underneath it all, something else. It wasn't the deep, rattling vibration from the mine, but a softer version of it, so quiet she might have mistaken it for the memory of a sound. She pressed her palm to the countertop. It was trembling. The knock came next. 3 slow raps against her front door, evenly spaced, each one just loud enough to echo faintly through the small house. Her first thought was Mark, that maybe he'd changed his mind, decided to come talk. But when she looked at the clock, she saw it was nearly 1:15 in the morning. The knock came again. She didn't go to the door. Instead, she crossed to the living room window and pulled the curtain back an inch. The porch light flickered as though in sync with her pulse. Beyond it, the night was as black as the mine's deepest tunnels, swallowing the street and the trees. She could see the shape of her doorframe in the pale light, but no one stood there. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She crossed the room quickly, relief blooming in her chest when she saw Mark's name. But when she answered, it wasn't his voice. It was her father's again. "You have to come back." The words were flat, without the warmth they'd carried in the mine. Static swallowed the rest of the line, but in that static she thought she heard something else. Movement, like footsteps crunching on gravel. "Who is this?" she demanded, her own voice trembling. A pause. Then, "You know who." The call ended. Claire locked the door and every window, then sat at the kitchen table with her back to the wall. She left the recorder on, letting it capture the silence. She didn't remember falling asleep, only that she woke with the gray light of dawn spilling across the floor. When she checked the recorder, there was nothing unusual until the last 30 seconds. That was when the faint hum started again. This time, there was a whisper layered in it. Not her name, her address. She spent the morning pacing the house, her mind running in frantic circles. She could leave, just pack a bag, get in her car, and keep driving until the mine and whatever it contained were hundreds of miles behind her. But she knew herself too well. She wouldn't be able to stop thinking about Hollis, about her father's voice, about what she'd seen suspended in that chamber. By noon, she was in her car, heading toward Mark's place. His house sat at the edge of town, half hidden behind a tangle of pines. She knocked once, then again. No answer. She tried the handle, it turned easily. Inside, the air smelled stale, like the windows hadn't been opened in days. A thin layer of dust coated the coffee table. Mark's boots were by the door, his jacket slung over a chair. She called his name. No response. In the kitchen, she found a half-finished mug of coffee, cold to the touch. The clock above the sink had stopped at 3:42. That was when she heard it, soft, steady, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. The hum. It was faint but unmistakable, and as she followed it down the hall, it grew sharper, more focused. It led her to the basement door. She hesitated with her hand on the knob, every instinct screaming at her to leave. She opened it anyway. The stairs descended into darkness. Halfway down, her phone vibrated in her pocket. Without thinking, she pulled it out. The screen was black, not off, but displaying a perfect, featureless black that seemed almost textured. She felt her pulse jump as the surface rippled, like the display was made of liquid. A voice came from it, not from the speaker, from the black itself. "You shouldn't have come here," it said in Mark's voice, though she knew it wasn't him. The phone shut off on its own. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found Mark. He was sitting in a wooden chair in the center of the basement, facing the far wall. His hands rested limply on his knees, his head tilted slightly to one side. She stepped closer, calling his name again, but he didn't move. That was when she saw the spirals. They covered the far wall, hundreds of them, just like in the mine, some carved deep into the wood, others drawn hastily in black marker. In the center of the largest spiral, a dark, wet patch was spreading slowly, as though something behind the wall was bleeding through. "Mark!" she said again, louder this time. He turned his head. His eyes were gone. The skin where they'd been was smooth, unbroken, as if they had never existed at all. "You brought them here," he said, his voice flat, empty. Before she could move, the wet patch on the wall pulsed outward, a ripple passing through it like muscle under skin. Something pressed against it from the other side, a shape vaguely human, but bent in ways a body shouldn't bend. The wood splintered. Claire bolted for the stairs, the hum swelling into a deafening roar. She could hear the sound of the wall giving way, the thing behind it tearing free. She didn't look back. She slammed the basement door shut and threw her weight against it. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then came the slow, deliberate sound of something climbing the stairs on the other side. She didn't wait. She ran out the front door, down the driveway, and into her car. Gravel spat from her tires as she sped back toward town. It wasn't until she was halfway home that she realized she could still hear the hum. It was coming from inside the car. The hum filled the car like a second engine, low and steady, vibrating through the steering wheel into Claire's bones. She gripped it harder, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination, that the terror of the basement, the thing behind the wall, had primed her brain to hear sounds that weren't there. Then the rearview mirror shifted. Not tilted, not bumped, it shifted. The glass itself warped for a moment, like a drop of water hitting a still pond. In its distorted reflection, she saw the back seat, and someone sitting in it, her father. He was leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on the seat in front of him, his eyes just visible under the brim of the old ball cap he'd worn during their fishing trips. His mouth moved, but the sound that came out wasn't his voice. It was the mind's hum, compressed and sharpened until it scraped against her ears like metal on stone. She swerved hard to the shoulder, throwing the car into park. Her chest was so tight she couldn't tell if she was breathing. She turned around. The back seat was empty. Her hands shook as she started driving again. The hum faded but never disappeared entirely, slipping in and out of the edges of her hearing. It stayed with her all the way home, like a passenger she couldn't shake. When she pulled into her driveway, she noticed something wrong. The porch light was on. She'd turned it off before leaving. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but she couldn't. The thought of the mine, of the spirals, of Mark sitting blank-eyed in his basement. None of it made sense, and running would only leave her wondering. She needed answers. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and froze. The house was too quiet. It wasn't silence. Silence had a weight, a fullness. This was absence. As if the house itself had stopped existing in the places she couldn't see. She tested it, clapping her hands. The sound was muffled, dulled, as though the air couldn't carry it. The hum was gone. She almost felt relief, until she walked into the kitchen and saw the spirals. They were drawn on the walls, the counters, the refrigerator. Some small enough to fit on a fingertip, others sprawling across entire panels of cabinet wood. They were done in different materials, chalk, ink, something that looked like oil, and yet they all matched the exact design from the mine. And in the center of the largest one, drawn across the tile floor, was her address. She stumbled back toward the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The sudden movement of the air was followed by another sound. Footsteps. Not behind her, not above her, but inside the walls. Slow and deliberate, moving in patterns she couldn't follow. The lights flickered again, and in the dim, she thought she saw shapes in the corners of the room, darker than shadow. Not moving toward her, just watching. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She didn't want to answer it, but her hand moved on its own, pulling it free. The screen lit up with a single word. Below, she didn't have time to react before the floor under her right foot gave way. She dropped hard, the world snapping into black as she tumbled into what felt like open space. When she landed, the air was colder than anything she'd felt in the mine. The smell was the same, though, that faint metallic tang laced with something sweet and rotting. She tried her flashlight, but the beam was swallowed by the darkness, revealing only a sliver of slick stone beneath her. She turned slowly. Behind her, impossibly far away, was a wall covered in spirals. They pulsed faintly, their light just enough to outline a tunnel ahead. She moved toward it, not because she wanted to, but because something in her bones told her she had no choice. The hum started again. This time it was weaker, as though it came from a great distance. But layered within it were whispers, so many overlapping voices she could barely pick out words. She caught fragments. Still waiting? Your turn? We've always known. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber. It was too large to be part of the mine, so large she couldn't see the ceiling. Shapes moved in the shadows above, shifting in slow arcs, like massive creatures swimming in black water. In the center of the chamber was a pit. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was a hole that seemed to devour the glow from her flashlight entirely, as if it led somewhere light itself refused to go. Around its rim stood 13 figures, their bodies thin and impossibly long, their faces obscured by bone-white masks carved with the spiral pattern. One of them raised its head, and though she couldn't see its eyes, she knew it was looking directly at her. "Claire," it said, and the voice was her own. The others joined in, each repeating her name in her voice, overlapping until the sound became unbearable. She stepped back, her heels skimming the edge of the pit. The hum deepened until it rattled her teeth, until her vision blurred. The masked figures began to move. Not toward her, but into the pit, one by one, folding their bodies in unnatural ways as they disappeared into the darkness. When the last one was gone, the hum stopped. For a heartbeat, there was only stillness. Then something in the pit moved. It rose slowly, without sound, until it was level with her feet. It wasn't a shape she could name. Parts of it were stone, parts flesh, parts something her mind refused to register. At its center was a mouth, and inside that mouth was her father's voice. "You're coming with me now." The floor beneath her cracked. She fell. The sensation of falling was unlike any she had known. Neither weightless nor crushing, but something in between, like she was being carried downward by a current that had chosen her. There was no wind against her skin, no rush of air, only the steady, rhythmic thud of the hum, slower now, like a heartbeat at rest. She didn't hit the bottom so much as arrive. One moment there was nothing. The next her feet were on something solid, smooth and warm like living flesh, yet cold as marble. She lifted her flashlight, but the beam could barely reach beyond arm's length. The light simply died at the edges, consumed by the dark. Her father's voice came from everywhere at once. "Do you know what this place is?" Claire swallowed hard. "It's the mine, or under the mine." A low, almost amused sound rippled through the black. "The mine was only a doorway. Long before men cut into it, we were here, watching." Shapes began to move at the edge of her vision. Too fast to track, too large to comprehend. Some crawled along the unseen walls, others swam through the dark air, their bodies bending in ways that made her stomach twist. "What do you want from me?" she asked. The voice shifted. Now it was Hollis. "You came to help." Then Mark. "You brought us what we needed." Then, disturbingly, her own voice. "You've always belonged here." The ground beneath her began to pulse, a slow, deliberate rhythm matching the hum. With each pulse, faint light seeped upward through cracks in the surface, illuminating spirals carved deep into the floor. The patterns were endless, looping into one another in ways that made her dizzy if she stared too long. She realized then that she was standing in the center of one. "Step forward," her father's voice said. Every muscle in her body resisted. She took a step back instead. The hum changed, no longer steady, but sharp, fractured, like the cracking of ice. Something unseen moved quickly around her, brushing against her arms, her legs, the back of her neck. Her flashlight flickered, and in that stuttering light she caught glimpses. Faces without eyes, bodies without symmetry, teeth set in places no mouth should be. "You can't leave now," the voices said, dozens of them in perfect unison. Claire turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going. There was no path, no tunnel, only the endless spirals under her feet. But in the distance she saw something. A vertical line of pale light, faint and thin, but unmistakably different from the darkness around it. She ran toward it, the hum pounding like a drum in her skull. The shapes closed in, their movements faster, more erratic. Something long and cold wrapped briefly around her ankle, but she kicked free without looking back. The light grew. It wasn't bright. Not sunlight, but the weak, sickly glow of a cloudy afternoon. She could hear wind again, real wind, whistling faintly. Her hand hit stone, and she realized the light was coming through a narrow crack in a wall of rock. She shoved her shoulder against it, but it didn't budge. Behind her, the hum rose to a deafening pitch, vibrating through her teeth, her bones, her thoughts. The crack widened on its own, not slowly, but with a sudden, violent lurch, as though something on the other side wanted her out. She stumbled through, hitting the ground hard on her knees. She was outside. The mine's gate stood in front of her, rusted and twisted exactly as it had been. The air was sharp and cold, the sky a flat sheet of gray. She turned back. The crack was gone. There was only the solid wall of the mine entrance, the faint echo of the wind, and the silence of the trees. Her recorder was still in her pocket. She pressed play. The first sounds were her own footsteps, her breath, the scrape of stone under her boots. Then the hum began, quieter than before. And then her father's voice again, whispering just 4 words. "See you at home." She shut it off and walked away from the mine without looking back. That night she didn't sleep. The lights in her house stayed on. Every so often, she thought she heard movement in the walls, a slow, patient rustle. Once, she caught a glimpse of a spiral drawn in condensation on her bathroom mirror. She wiped it away, but when she turned around, it was there again. By morning, she had packed a bag. She drove out of Rathburn without telling anyone, without stopping. 2 weeks later, a new report hit the local paper. A hiker had gone missing near the old mine. His last known phone call, according to investigators, was to an unknown number. In the recording, they said he could be heard asking a woman named Claire for help. And underneath his voice, barely audible, was the hum. The first body turned up in the river. It was early spring, the ice just breaking in long, jagged sheets that drifted lazily downstream, and the thawing banks gave the water a smell that clung to everything. Wet earth, rotting leaves, the faint tang of old metal. When the boy was found, snagged on a tangle of roots near the bend, the locals whispered the same thing they always did when someone went missing in Millstone. The river had taken him. But the river had never returned anyone like that before. Deputy Allen was the first to see him up close. He'd been with the department long enough to know what drowning victims looked like. Skin bloated, lips blue, eyes clouded over. This wasn't that. The boy's skin was dry, almost mummified, as though the water hadn't touched him at all. His clothes were intact, though frayed at the edges in ways that looked less like wear and more like gnawing. And then there were his hands. The fingers were bent backwards, each joint locked at an impossible angle. Allen swore he'd never seen rigor mortis set in that way, but when he tried to straighten one, he found the bones snapped under the lightest pressure, crumbling like chalk. They didn't identify him until 2 days later. His name was Christopher Hale, 17 years old, last seen leaving a friend's house on the far side of town. He'd vanished in December. No one could explain how he'd ended up in the river, 30 miles from where he'd last been seen, months later, looking as if no time had passed at all, except for the ruin of his hands. The sheriff wanted to close it quickly, put it down as an accident, maybe a case of hypothermia gone wrong. But then the second body turned up. It was a woman this time, late 30s, found half buried in the silt near the old mill. She'd been missing for 5 years. Her clothes were faded and threadbare, but like Christopher, her skin was dry, her hands twisted backward at the joints. And in her mouth, when the coroner finally pried it open, was a single stone, smooth and black, no bigger than a coin. After that, people started talking about the river again. Not in the usual, half-joking way, but in lowered voices, glancing over their shoulders. Millstone had a history, and everyone knew it, even if they didn't say it out loud. The stories went back to the early settlers, when the river was the only reason the town existed at all. It powered the mill, watered the crops, and served as the main trade route. But it had also been the site of things. Drownings, disappearances, and in one infamous winter, the entire Walsh family vanishing from their home by the banks. Some folks swore the river was cursed. Others said there was something living in it, older than the town, older than the people who came before the settlers. Lena didn't believe any of it. She'd grown up in Millstone, left for college, and come back with a degree in environmental science and a grant to study water pollution. She knew the river was dangerous. Fast currents under the surface, deep pockets where a person could get caught, but she didn't believe in curses. To her, it was just a stretch of water with bad PR. But the bodies unsettled her, and when the third one turned up, a man who'd gone missing in 1998, his hands twisted just like the others, she decided to take a closer look. She started with the obvious water samples. She collected them from the bend where Christopher had been found, from the mill, from the shallow pools downstream. Nothing unusual, some elevated levels of iron and bacteria, but nothing that explained the condition of the bodies. Then she began mapping the recovery sites. That's when she noticed the pattern. Each of the bodies had been found within a half-mile of where one of the old ferry docks used to be. The docks had rotted away decades ago, but their posts still jutted up in places like broken teeth. When she plotted them on a map, they formed a line along the river that didn't match its natural curve, almost as if they were marking something beneath the surface. She took her notes to Deputy Allen. "I'm telling you," she said, spreading the map out on his desk. "This isn't random. Someone or something is putting the bodies here." Allen leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You're assuming there's a someone to put him. These people could have gone in anywhere upstream and just drifted. Months? Years? In perfect condition? No signs of bloating or decay. Allen, the water would have torn them apart." He didn't answer, just drummed his fingers on the desk. Finally, he said, "You want my advice? Drop it. Millstone's been around a long time. Things happen here we don't explain, and we do just fine not explaining them." She left his office angry, but by the time she got home, her anger had turned to curiosity. That night, she drove to the river. It was quiet. No frogs, no insects, just the sound of the current sliding over itself in the dark. She parked near the bend where Christopher had been found and walked down to the bank, her flashlight cutting a narrow path through the fog. The posts from the old ferry dock rose out of the water, slick and black. She was about to turn back when she saw it. Something pale just under the surface drifting toward her. She knelt, thinking it was a piece of wood, maybe a bleached log. But as it neared the bank, it rolled, and she saw the curve of a skull. Her stomach clenched. She reached for her phone, but before she could dial, the skull dipped under again, pulled backward into the dark as if caught on a line. And then she saw the hands. They were just visible in the beam of her flashlight, bent backward at impossible angles, reaching toward her before vanishing into the current. The water went still. Lena stood there for a long time, staring at the place where it had disappeared, until the cold finally drove her back to the car. The next morning, she checked the local news. No body had been found. That was when she realized something she hadn't noticed last night. Her shoes were wet, but not with river water. The soles were coated in a fine, black silt that smelled faintly of stone and iron. The same smell that came from the black stone found in the woman's mouth. The silt stayed in her mind all day. Lena tried to dismiss it as simple coincidence. River mud was river mud, but she couldn't shake the smell. It wasn't the usual earthy, swampy odor she'd grown up with along Millstone's banks. This was mineral-rich, sharp, like something unearthed from deep underground. By late afternoon, she was back at the river with sampling jars and a metal trowel. She went straight to the old ferry post where she'd seen the pale shape the night before and began scraping the riverbed. It was harder than she expected. Just beneath the thin layer of sand, the ground gave way to a dense, almost clay-like deposit of black sediment. When she brought it to her nose, the smell hit her again. Stone and iron with something faintly metallic and sweet, like rusted blood. She filled a jar, labeled it, and packed it away. But before she could stand, something touched her hand. It was light, almost gentle, but it made every muscle in her arm tighten. She jerked back, sending a spray of water across the dock post. The surface rippled where her hand had been. Nothing emerged. She stayed there, kneeling in the mud, trying to convince herself it had just been a bit of floating debris. But deep down, she knew. The touch had been deliberate. That night, she sent the sample to the lab at the university where she'd done her thesis. She didn't tell them what it was from, just asked for a full composition breakdown. The reply came faster than she expected. Unusual mineral composition, high concentrations of hematite and magnetite, possible volcanic origin, organic trace matter unknown, structure inconsistent with plant or animal tissue. The unknown sat like a stone in her stomach. 2 days later, another body surfaced. This one was a child, maybe 10 years old. No one in town recognized him. Same dry, preserved skin. Same twisted hands. And in his mouth, this time, 3 of the black stones, stacked neatly on top of each other. Lena drove to the scene, flashing her old volunteer badge from her environmental work to get past the tape. The boy lay on the bank, covered partially with a sheet, but she caught a glimpse of his eyes before the coroner zipped the bag. They were open, and they were looking at the river. She found Deputy Allen near the cruisers. "You can't tell me this is normal," she said. "This is a pattern. You see it. I know you do." Allen rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Doesn't matter what I see. I'm not the one writing the reports. So who is? Sheriff Brackett. And you won't convince him of anything he doesn't already believe." Lena lowered her voice. "Then tell me off the record. What's going on with the stones?" Allen hesitated. "They're not from here. Not this river, not this county. Geology says they shouldn't even exist within 100 miles of Millstone." "Then where?" "Don't ask," he cut in. "If you know what's good for you, you'll stop digging." But Lena couldn't. That night, she returned to the river with waders, a waterproof headlamp, and a weighted rope. If the stones weren't from here, she wanted to know where they came from. She waded in carefully, feeling the current push against her legs. The water was cold, numbing quickly. She dropped the weighted rope and began sweeping it in slow arcs, pulling it back each time to see what it caught. On the 4th drop, she felt resistance. She pulled harder, but whatever it was seemed anchored. She braced herself and gave a sharp tug, and something pulled back. The force was sudden, strong enough to drag her forward a step. She let go of the rope. It disappeared into the dark, vanishing without a ripple. The current shifted, not the way wind shifts water, but as if something massive had moved beneath her feet. A low vibration hummed through her legs, up into her chest, familiar in a way she didn't want to think about. Her headlamp caught movement downstream. First, she thought it was driftwood. Then it rolled, and she saw a face, half submerged, eyes open, mouth full of black stones. It was moving against the current. She stumbled backward to shore, not taking her eyes off it. The face disappeared, replaced by another and another. Pale skin, twisted hands, all drifting silently upstream. By the time she reached the bank, her breathing was ragged. She backed up toward her car, her gaze fixed on the water. The river was empty again. The next morning, she woke to find her waders, still hanging by the back door, coated in black silt from the knees down. She could have believed she tracked it there herself, except for the fact that the soles of the boots were dry. And inside one of the boots was a single black stone. The following evening, Allen called her. His voice was low, urgent. "Meet me at the mill. 10 o'clock. Don't tell anyone." The mill had been abandoned since the 60s, its skeletal frame leaning precariously over the water. When Lena arrived, Allen was waiting by the rusted loading dock. "3 more bodies," he said without preamble. "All in the last 24 hours. No IDs. All with stones. Why call me? Because you're the only one who's asking the right questions. And because..." He hesitated. "I think they're putting them back." Lena frowned. "Back where?" He nodded toward the water. "Watch." The river was calm, moonlight glinting off its surface. Then, without warning, something broke through. A pale arm, twisted backward at the elbow, clutching a handful of black stones. It sank almost immediately, leaving only a faint ripple behind. Another followed. Then another. "They're not washing up," Allen said. "They're coming from somewhere, and they're going back." Lena's skin prickled. "So what's under the river?" Allen glanced at her, his face pale in the moonlight. "Not what. Who?" The word who hung in the air long after Allen spoke it. It didn't belong. Rivers didn't have whos. They had what's: fish, currents, silt, things you could measure. A who implied a mind, and a mind meant intent. Alan lit a cigarette, shielding the match from the wind. My grandfather used to talk about it, he said finally. Back before the mill shut down, people would disappear, always near the water. The old folks called it the ferryman. Lena folded her arms. Like the Greek myth? Sort of. Only here, he doesn't wait for you to die before he takes you. She almost laughed, but the image of the pale arm clutching stones killed the impulse. You think there's a person living under the river? Alan exhaled a slow stream of smoke. Not a person. Not anymore. They stood in silence, watching the black water slide past. Somewhere in the dark, Wood groaned, the old bones of the mill shifting with the current. Tomorrow night, Alan said. Bring your waders, and something to tie off with. They met again just before midnight. Lena came armed with a waterproof bag, extra sampling jars, and a GoPro strapped to her chest. Alan brought a flashlight with a beam strong enough to cut through the mist, and a length of climbing rope coiled over his shoulder. They waded in from the bank, the water numbing their legs almost instantly. Alan tied the rope to a dock post, securing the other end to his belt. We follow the old ferry line, he said. Stay close. The current's worse than it looks. The river bottom was uneven, their boots sinking into silt with every step. Lena kept her eyes on the faint shapes under the surface, branches, rocks, the occasional flash of fish. But then she saw something else. A shape, long and pale, lying still. She turned her headlamp toward it. Not a log. A body. The skin was dry, like the others, and the hands twisted, frozen mid-reach. As they passed, the head turned toward her. She gasped, losing her footing. The current pulled at her legs, but Alan grabbed her arm before she went under. Don't look at them, he said. They pressed on until the posts from the old ferry dock rose out of the dark. Beneath them, the river seemed to deepen sharply, the current pulling toward an unseen drop. Alan motioned for her to stop. This is it. Lena crouched, dipping a sampling jar into the current. But before she could cap it, something brushed against her boot. She jerked back. It was a hand. It gripped her ankle with surprising strength, fingers bent backward but locked tight. She kicked, breaking free, and the hand sank into the dark. Then the water began to move. It didn't flow downstream anymore. It swirled, a slow spiral drawing them toward the drop beneath the ferry posts. The current pulled harder, tugging at the rope around Alan's waist. Back! He shouted, but the spiral tightened. Beneath them, something massive shifted. Too slow to be an animal, too deliberate to be debris. Then Lena saw them. Faces. Dozens of them. Just beneath the surface. Eyes open, mouths stuffed with black stones. They weren't floating, they were rising, pulled upward by the same spiral that had them. The rope went taut as Alan was dragged forward. He grabbed a post, holding fast. Lena did the same, her nails digging into the wet wood. And then the faces began to move against the current. Not swimming, walking. Their legs bent strangely, joints reversed, feet dragging through the silt. Their hands reached upward, palms out, fingers curled backward like claws. Alan swore under his breath. They're not dead. The nearest figure reached the surface. Its mouth opened, spilling black stones into the current. Where they touched the water, the spiral pulled faster. Cut the rope, Alan said. Lena stared at him. What? Cut it. We're anchored to the pull. She fumbled for the knife on her belt, slicing through the rope. The moment it parted, the pull eased. They stumbled backward, the figures slowing their rise. One of them lifted its head, looking straight at her. Its eyes were cloudy, but not blind. It knew she was there. They retreated to the bank, hearts pounding. The river was calm again, the spiral gone as if it had never been. Alan leaned against a tree, breathing hard. Now you've seen it. Lena swallowed. What are they? He shook his head. I told you, the ferryman's not a story. He's real. And those are his passengers. She thought of the stones, the dry skin, the twisted hands. Why are they coming back? Maybe they never left, Alan said. Maybe the river's just the top of it. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the scrape of those twisted hands against the posts, seeing the faces rising through the dark. By morning, her exhaustion had given way to determination. If there was something beneath the river, something taking people, she had to know how deep it went. She spent the day researching old ferry maps, tracing the post's alignment to a spot a quarter-mile downstream where the river widened into a slow, dark pool. Historical records called it Karen's Rest, though no one alive seemed to know why. By dusk, she was there with Alan, standing at the edge of the pool. The water was glassy, still enough to reflect the pale disk of the moon. But when she tossed a pebble in, the ripples didn't spread outward. They spread inward, toward the center. Alan's jaw tightened. It's open. Before she could ask what that meant, a low sound rose from the water. Not a splash, not a current. A deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in her bones. And then the pool began to sink. Not drain, sink. The surface dropped in a perfect circle, revealing slick stone walls beneath. Figures clung to them, pale and twisted, moving slowly downward into the widening darkness. Lena stepped forward without thinking, her eyes fixed on the opening below. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the hum change, felt it recognize her. And in that moment, she understood why the bodies came back dry. They hadn't drowned. They'd been waiting. The stone walls seemed to breathe. At first Lena thought it was just the play of shadows from her headlamp, but the movement was too slow, too deliberate. Patches of slick black moss pulsed faintly, expanding and contracting like something alive. Alan grabbed her arm. Don't get closer. But she was already leaning forward, her eyes locked on the figures clinging to the walls. They weren't climbing down. They were being drawn, inch by inch, toward a black opening at the bottom of the sinkhole. The hum that had begun as a low vibration in her bones now resonated in her teeth, like standing too close to an engine. The water surface was now 10 feet lower than the bank. The current that had once fed into the pool was gone. The river itself seemed to be holding its breath. Whatever's down there, Alan said. It's awake. They heard it before they saw it. A faint scrape, like stone grinding against stone. Then the figures nearest the opening began to move faster, their limbs jerking as if pulled by invisible threads. One by one, they vanished into the dark. Alan took a step back. We shouldn't be here. Lena didn't move. Her hand had gone instinctively to the small GoPro mounted to her chest. If she left now, the images in her head would fade to memory, doubtable, deniable. If she stayed, she could bring back proof. The last of the figures disappeared into the opening. For a moment there was silence. Then something reached out. It wasn't a hand. It was longer than a human arm, pale as bone, jointed in too many places. It extended upward with unnatural grace, curling over the lip of the opening like a spider's leg. Another followed, and another, until there were 6 in total, gripping the stone walls with backward bent claws. The thing pulled itself upward. Lena's mind rejected what she saw. It was shaped almost like a person, but stretched wrong. Its head was smooth and eyeless, with a mouth that opened vertically down the center. From it spilled a sound like the hum, only sharper, burrowing into her skull. Alan yanked her back. Go! They stumbled along the bank as the thing began to climb, its limbs folding and unfolding in ways that made her stomach twist. The hum grew louder. Halfway to the car, Lena realized the trees around them were vibrating. Not from the sound, but in response to it, their leaves shivering as though in a sudden wind. She risked a glance back. The thing was out of the sinkhole now, standing on the surface of the water. Its legs didn't break the surface tension. Around its feet, the black stones floated like pollen, drifting outward in perfect circles. Alan fumbled with the car keys. Get in! They slammed the doors and locked them. The hum didn't stop. Pressed against the windows, rattled the dashboard. Lena's vision swam. The creature stepped onto the bank. The grass beneath its feet blackened instantly, curling inward like paper in a flame. It moved toward them with the slow certainty of something that had never had to hurry. Lena's heart hammered. It's not stopping. Alan turned the ignition. The car roared to life, and they tore away from the river, the headlights cutting swaths through the mist. Even after the road curved and the trees closed in, she could feel it, like a weight on her spine, leaning forward. They didn't stop until they reached Lena's house. The hum had faded, replaced by the ordinary chirp of crickets. Still, she half expected to see the thing standing at the end of her driveway. Inside, she stripped off the wet waders and checked the GoPro. The footage was there, grainy, dark, but enough to make her hands shake. The figures, the sinkhole, the thing. Alan poured himself a glass of whiskey. Now what? We tell someone, Lena said. Who? Brackett? He'll laugh us out of town. Or worse, he'll shut it down. She hesitated. Then we go public. Alan shook his head. You don't understand. If people start coming here, they'll disappear faster than we can count. The ferryman doesn't stop because we put him on the news. She hated that he was right. That night, Lena woke to the sound of running water. She thought it was the bathroom sink, but when she opened the door, the house was silent. Then she noticed it, the faint hum, coming from the kitchen. She crept down the hall. The tap was dry, but in the sink lay a single black stone, and beside it muddy footprints, leading from the door to her bedroom. The next morning, Alan showed up looking worse than she felt. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes wrinkled. You got them too? He asked. The footprints. He nodded. My place. Only mine didn't stop in the bedroom. They went out the back door. Toward the river. Lena glanced toward her own door. The prints were still there. Alan leaned in. We've got to close it. How? The same way they used to. My grandfather told me. Before the mill, before the ferry, they sank a barge full of iron chains in the pool. Kept it sealed for 30 years. When the chains rusted through, it opened again. She thought of the iron-rich silt in her first sample. And you think we can do that? I think we have to try. That night, they borrowed a rusted old skiff from the bait shop. Lena loaded it with scrap iron scavenged from the mill, each piece bound with heavy chain. They rowed to Karen's Rest under a moonless sky, the water so still it felt like rowing across oil. The hum started before they reached the center. Alan began tossing the iron overboard, the chains clanking in the dark. Each splash seemed to be swallowed rather than echoed, the water drinking the sound whole. Halfway through the load, Lena froze. Something was rising beneath them. It wasn't the thing from before, it was smaller, human-shaped. His head broke the surface, mouth spilling black stones. Then another rose, and another, surrounding the skiff in a silent ring. Alan threw the last of the chains into the water. Row! They cut through the circle, the figures watching them without moving. But as they reached the bank, the hum changed pitch, higher now, sharper. The water behind them began to spiral again. By the time they dragged the skiff onto the grass, the spiral was deep enough to see the slick stone walls. But this time, the opening at the bottom was already closing. The figures clinging to the walls began to sink, their pale hands vanishing into the dark. The hum faded, and then silence. Alan dropped to his knees, gasping. We did it. Lena wasn't so sure. She stepped closer to the bank, peering into the water. The surface was perfectly still, moonlight dancing across it. But just before she turned away, she saw it. One last black stone rising slowly from the depths, breaking the surface before sinking again. Like a promise. The morning air was thick with fog, the world outside Lena's window muffled and pale. She stared down at the black stone resting in the palm of her hand. It was heavier than it looked, smooth as glass but cold to the touch, as if it had absorbed centuries of river water and dark secrets. Alan hadn't shown up yet. He'd promised to call at dawn, but the silence between her phone and the void of unanswered messages felt heavier than any chain. She felt the rivers pull inside her, a whispering tide she couldn't ignore. The ferryman was still out there, somewhere beneath the surface, waiting. The next few days passed in a blur. Lena kept vigil by the riverbank, watching the water for signs. Ripples, bubbles, anything to hint the sinkhole was waking again. The town was quieter than usual. Sheriff Brackett had cracked down on rumors, spreading tales of algae blooms and natural erosion to cover the truth. But Lena knew better. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she saw movement. Near the mill, a figure stood at the water's edge. It was Alan. His clothes were soaked, his eyes dark and wild. "They're back," he whispered. "Who?" "The passengers. The ferryman's calling again. I found more stones in my house. Footprints." She handed him her black stone. "We tried to seal it." Alan shook his head. "You can't seal something that lives beneath the river. It's patient. It waits until the chains rust, the iron corrodes, and then it's free." That night they went back to the pool to Karen's rest. The water was unervingly calm, reflecting the stars like a polished mirror. The iron chains they'd sunk were nowhere to be seen. Lena lowered a waterproof camera into the depths, the cable unspooling slowly. The screen showed smooth stone walls, covered in patches of that strange black moss. Then, deeper, the camera's light caught something. A faint glimmer of metal. The chains. Only they were broken. Something had torn through the rust, dragging the iron into the dark. A low hum began to rise again, slow and steady, rising like a chant in the depths. "Get out of here," Alan said, voice trembling. But Lena's curiosity burned hotter than fear. She wanted to see. She suggested a dive. Alan protested. "It's too dangerous." But she was already preparing her gear. The dive was colder than she expected. The river swallowed her whole, the surface breaking into glittering shards as she sank. Below, the sinkhole yawned like a dark maw. The water was thick, the silt swirling as she descended. Her flashlight barely cut through the gloom. At the bottom, the iron chains lay twisted and broken, tangled in the black moss. And beneath them, the mouth of a cavern opened. From inside came a faint glow, pulsing, alive. She swam closer. The cavern walls seemed to breathe with light, veins of crystal stretching into the dark. Then she saw them. Figures, pale, twisted, their mouths full of black stones, were gathered around the cavern's heart. They weren't dead. They were waiting. One turned to her. Its eyes were empty pits, but she felt its gaze pierce her soul. A hand reached out, this time human-like, beckoning. Lena broke the surface, gasping, the river cool against her face. Alan was waiting, eyes wide. "We can't stop it," she said. "Not with chains, not with stones. It's a part of this place now." The river roared softly around them, as if agreeing. In the following days, more bodies appeared. Twisted hands clutching black stones, eyes open, faces turned toward the river. The town whispered again, and the sheriff shook his head, dismissing fears. But Lena and Alan knew the truth. The ferryman was patient. He was eternal. And one day, when the stones rust and the chains fail, he would rise again to collect his passengers. Late one night, as Lena lay awake, she heard it again. A soft scraping at her window. She peered through the darkness and saw a pale hand, clawed and backward bent, pressing against the glass. Clutched in its palm were 3 black stones, stacked like a twisted invitation. She closed the curtains slowly, the hum of the river echoing in her ears. Outside, the river flowed on, carrying secrets no one would ever fully understand. In the winter of 1978, the small town of Ravens Hollow was swallowed by a darkness thicker than the longest night. It started with the lights. One by one, the town's street lamps blinked out, leaving the streets bathed only in the faint glow of a sickly moon. At first, the residents thought it was a simple blackout, the kind that came with winter storms. But the power grid was intact, humming quietly in the distance like a living thing. No explanation came. As the days grew colder, strange things began to surface in Raven's Hollow. Things that whispered in the shadows and stirred beneath frozen earth. The first was the disappearance of children. Not all at once, but steadily, like pieces being pulled from a puzzle that no one wanted to complete. Their toys abandoned in snowdrifts, their bedrooms untouched except for a lingering chill that seemed to seep into the very walls. The townsfolk whispered about the hollow itself, a deep forest on the edge of town, where the trees grew so thick and tangled that sunlight never reached the ground. The place was avoided by hunters and hikers alike, who spoke of unnatural silence and eyes watching from the shadows. No one dared enter the hollow in winter, except for one man, Elias Morrow. Elias was a recluse, a man of few words and many secrets. He lived on the outskirts of Raven's Hollow in a cabin so old it leaned with the weight of years and untold stories. He was a scholar of the occult, obsessed with ancient lore and forgotten rites. When the children vanished, the town's suspicion turned to fear, and then to Elias. They said he consorted with things that shouldn't exist, that he called on forces darker than the night itself. Some said he was responsible for the disappearances. Others claimed he was the only one who could stop them. One frigid evening, as the wind howled like a banshee and the moon hid behind ragged clouds, a group of townsfolk gathered at Elias's cabin. They pounded on the door, shouting for answers. Elias opened it slowly, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight. "What do you want?" he asked. "Where are the children?" He said nothing. Instead, he motioned for them to follow him inside. The cabin was cluttered with dusty books, strange symbols etched into the walls, and jars filled with unidentifiable objects floating in thick liquid. Elias led them to a large map pinned to the wall, a detailed drawing of the hollow, marked with strange runes and circles. "The hollow is alive," he said. "It's not just a forest. It's a gateway." The room fell silent. "A gateway to what?" one of the men asked. "To the void." Elias explained that the void was an ancient realm, a place of shadows and silence beyond human understanding. He believed the hollow was a thinning veil between worlds, and that something from the void was reaching through. The children, he said, had been taken, not by human hands, but by the creatures that lurked beyond the veil. As the townsfolk listened, a deep rumble shook the cabin. The windows rattled, and the air grew colder still. Outside, the hollow seemed to lean closer, its darkness pressing against the thin walls like a living thing. Elias turned to the group. "We must enter the hollow at dawn. If we don't, the darkness will consume us all." None of them wanted to go, but with no other choice they agreed. As the first light of morning filtered through the frost-covered trees, Elias and the group stepped into the hollow, into the shadowed heart of a mystery that would change Raven's Hollow forever. The forest swallowed them immediately. It wasn't just the sheer density of the trees, gnarled branches clawing at the sky, thick trunks standing like silent sentinels, but the oppressive silence that blanketed everything. No birds sang, no wind rustled leaves, no animals scurried. Even their footsteps felt muted, swallowed by the cold, damp earth. Elias led the group deeper, his face unreadable beneath the hood of his worn coat. The runes on the map had marked a path, winding through the thickest part of the hollow, past ancient stones and twisted roots. After nearly an hour, the trees began to thin, revealing a clearing choked by an unnatural mist that swirled just above the frozen ground. In the center stood a great stone archway, crumbled and covered in moss, carved with symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. "This," Elias said, "is the Veil Gate." The crowd exchanged uneasy glances. None had dared believe such things existed, but here it was, proof carved in stone. "Why have you brought us here?" a woman asked, clutching her shawl tighter. To close the gate, Elias said simply. Close it? The man who'd questioned him before scoffed. You expect us to believe you can just shut down a doorway to the void? Elias's eyes burned. I have no choice. If this gate remains open, the darkness will consume Raven's Hollow. All of us. He gestured toward the archway, and the mist shifted, revealing shadowy figures lurking just beyond. They were tall, gaunt, their faces obscured by darkness but their eyes glowing faintly red. Those are the Watchers, Elias explained. They guard the veil, and they ensure no one crosses without their permission. But something has changed. They've grown restless. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the clearing, followed by a chilling howl that shook the very air. The figures moved forward, their steps silent but deliberate. Get ready, Elias commanded. The townsfolk grasped whatever they could as weapons. Sticks, tools, even their bare hands. But against these creatures, their efforts seemed futile. From his satchel, Elias pulled out a bundle of herbs and a small iron dagger inscribed with ancient symbols. He began to chant in a language no one recognized, and a flickering blue light emanated from the dagger, casting long shadows across the mist. The Watchers recoiled, their forms flickering like shadows caught in a flame. The air crackled with energy as Elias's voice grew louder, the chant echoing off the trees and into the depths of the hollow. Suddenly, one of the creatures lunged, disappearing into a wisp of smoke only to reappear behind a man. The man screamed as icy hands closed around his throat, dragging him backward into the mist. Panic surged through the group. Shouts and cries filled the clearing as the Watchers closed in. Elias intensified the chant, throwing herbs into the air that burst into violet flames. The creatures hissed and retreated, but the damage was done. 2 of the townsfolk were missing, swallowed by the mist. We can't hold them off forever, someone shouted. We have to reach the gate, Elias yelled. The group pressed forward, fighting through the fog and the Watchers' relentless pursuit. Every step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was fighting against them. Finally, they reached the archway. Elias placed his hands on the cold stone, his chanting reaching a crescendo. The runes glowed bright, then erupted in a wave of blue light that spread across the clearing. The Watchers screamed, a sound that chilled the blood and vanished like smoke on the wind. The mist began to dissipate, revealing the familiar forest floor beneath. The gate shimmered, then crumbled to dust. Elias collapsed to his knees, exhausted but victorious. The survivors gathered, relief washing over their faces. But as they turned to leave, Lena, a young woman who had been quiet all along, paused. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, pale, and with eyes that glowed brighter than any Watchers. It smiled. Did you really think the void would be so easily closed? It whispered. The forest darkened once more, and the gateway reformed behind it, stronger, wider, and hungrier than ever. The chilling words echoed in the minds of the small group, reverberating with a weight that none dared confront aloud. Lena's heart pounded fiercely in her chest as she took a hesitant step forward. The figure's eyes, 2 orbs of burning crimson light, held hers captive. It was as if time slowed, the mist thickening around them, pressing in from all sides. You can't close the void, it said again, voice like the rustling of dead leaves. It's part of the world, as much as you or I. Elias struggled to his feet, stumbling toward the apparition, clutching his dagger tightly. What do you want from us? The creature's smile widened, exposing sharp, elongated teeth that gleamed like frost in the moonlight. Your children, it said simply, and your fear. A collective gasp escaped from the group. The forest seemed to pulse with life, shadows coiling and stretching like serpents ready to strike. The trees groaned, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound rolled from deep within the hollow, something ancient and hungry, rising from the depths where the Veil Gate once stood. Elias raised his dagger again, chanting faster, his voice straining against the growl that now echoed through the clearing. But the creature before them laughed, a sound like cracking ice. Your chants are useless. The veil does not obey your magic. It obeys hunger. Lena felt a cold hand grip her wrist. She looked down to see a pair of pale, skeletal fingers curling around her arm. She jerked free, stumbling backward into Elias's arms. "We have to get out," Elias said urgently, eyes darting around as the shadows thickened. The creature's form began to shift, expanding and twisting into something monstrous. A swirling mass of darkness with limbs made of smoke and claw. The Watchers reappeared, surrounding the group, their eyes glowing like embers in the gloom. "We're trapped," Lena whispered, terror blooming in her chest. "No," Elias replied. "We're not." From his pocket, he pulled a small vial filled with a shimmering, silver liquid. "This is the essence of the Hollow, the only thing that can repel them." He uncorked the vial and hurled it into the midst of the Watchers. The liquid exploded on impact, releasing a brilliant light that pierced the mist like a beacon. The Watchers hissed and recoiled, retreating into the shadows with anguished cries. The monstrous figure shrieked, its form unraveling into tendrils of smoke that dissipated into the cold air. For a moment, silence reigned once more. But the victory was fleeting. From the edge of the clearing, a new sound emerged, soft footsteps crunching on dead leaves, slow and deliberate. Lena turned to see a young girl step from the trees, her eyes wide and unblinking, her skin unnaturally pale. The children who had vanished returned. But something was wrong. The girl's mouth hung open slightly, revealing black stones where her teeth should have been. She smiled, a horrifying, empty grin. "Come," she whispered. "The void calls." Elias grabbed Lena's arm. "We have to stop this, before it's too late." But the girl was already fading into the mist, beckoning the others deeper into the hollow. The forest closed around them once more, the veil gate pulsing faintly in the distance. An open wound in the fabric of reality, promising only darkness. The children's hollow eyes vanished into the mist like dying embers swallowed by night. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps as she and Elias stumbled through the thickening fog, the eerie silence broken only by the distant whispers of the void calling. The forest seemed alive, watching, waiting. Every shadow a threat, every sound amplified in the cold air. "We can't let them take more," Lena whispered, clutching Elias's arm. He nodded grimly. "The hollow feeds on fear and despair. It wants souls to cross over." As they moved forward, the trees grew twisted and blackened, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands reaching for salvation. Elias led her toward an ancient tree, its bark scarred and etched with strange runes glowing faintly beneath the frost. "This is the Heartwood," he said, voice low. "It's the source of the Hollow's power, and our only chance to stop the darkness." Lena approached cautiously, feeling the raw energy pulsing beneath the surface like a heartbeat. Elias began to chant, his voice steady but strained. The runes flared brighter, and the ground trembled beneath them. Suddenly, the air thickened, and the mist coalesced into a towering figure. A monstrous shadow with eyes like burning coals and teeth sharper than knives. "It's the Hollow's guardian," Elias said. "It won't let us touch the Heartwood." The creature lunged forward with terrifying speed, its claws tearing through the air. Lena dodged, heart racing, as Elias raised his dagger, the silver light casting eerie shadows on the frozen ground. The battle was fierce and desperate, a dance between light and darkness beneath the ancient trees. Elias's chants faltered as the creature's power pressed against them. But Lena remembered the vial of silver liquid. With trembling hands, she uncorked it and flung the shimmering essence at the beast. The liquid sizzled on contact, emitting a blinding light that sent the creature howling into the shadows. The forest seemed to exhale as the creature retreated, leaving the clearing bathed in an unnatural glow. Elias collapsed beside the Heartwood, exhausted but determined. "We have to bind the Veil Gate," he said. "Seal the hollow's power for good." He began to carve runes into the bark, the silver liquid soaking into the ancient wood and glowing with renewed life. The forest trembled, the shadows recoiling as the heartwood's light spread, weaving a web of protection around Raven's Hollow. For a moment hope flickered, but the silence that followed was uneasy, as if the darkness waited, patient and eternal. As dawn broke over the hollow, Lena and Elias emerged, weary but alive. The children were gone, but the scars remained. The townsfolk greeted them with relief and fear, knowing the darkness had been pushed back, not defeated. Lena looked toward the forest, its depths still whispering secrets she feared to hear again. Some mysteries, she knew, were meant to remain unsolved. Days passed in Raven's Hollow, the sunlight struggling to warm frozen earth and brittle souls alike. The town bore the scars of the Hollow's dark visitation. Empty homes, whispered rumors, and an ache in the air heavier than winter's frost. Elias sat by his hearth, the ancient tomes spread before him, but his eyes were distant. He knew the battle had been won only in part. The Hollow had been sealed, yes, but only temporarily. The Heartwood's power was a fragile barrier, a patch over a tear that would inevitably widen again. Lena entered the cabin, her breath clouding in the cold room. She held a small bundle wrapped in worn cloth, one of the black stones the missing children had carried. "Elias," she said softly, "these stones, they're still appearing, even after we sealed the gate." He took the stone carefully, turning it over in his hands. "They're a reminder," he said grimly. "A warning." That night, Lena walked alone to the edge of the hollow. The trees stood silent, their shadows long and deep beneath the crescent moon. She carried the stone in her pocket, feeling its weight like a heartbeat against her skin. As she approached the Heartwood, a whisper floated on the wind, soft, beckoning. She paused, the hairs on her neck rising. The forest seemed to breathe around her, alive with secrets and shadows. A voice called her name, faint but insistent. Lena's heart quickened. From the darkness, a figure emerged. A girl, pale and ethereal, her eyes gleaming with the same hollow light as before. "Come," the girl said, voice like the rustling leaves. "The void waits." Lena's breath caught. She looked down at the stone in her hand. It pulsed faintly, as if alive. "Not yet," Lena whispered and turned away, stepping back toward the town. But she knew the hollow's shadow would never truly leave. Some doors, once opened, refused to close forever. And the void, patient and eternal, would wait for the moment the veil grew thin again. In the years that followed, Raven's Hollow became a place of wary legend. Travelers spoke of strange lights in the woods, eerie whispers carried on the wind, and children who vanished without trace, only to return changed, their eyes empty as the void itself. No one spoke openly of the Hollow's true nature, but everyone knew the story, of darkness lurking just beyond the edge of light, waiting, watching. And beneath it all, a secret that no one could solve, how to truly defeat the hunger that dwelled in the shadows. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this chilling journey into the Hollow and its dark secrets, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more mysteries that will keep you up at night. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe in the shadows.